Welcome to Radical Feminist Perspectives. Today, we're going to hear about the book Not a Passing Phase by the Lesbian History Group, discussed by Sheila Jeffries and Marian Rutigliano. So welcome, and over to you two.
Good morning.
Thanks very much, Joe. Hello, everybody. Hello, sisters. Nice to be with you again and to be talking about this book, which I am really fond of. This book, the Lesbian History Group book, was written by members of the Lesbian History Group, including me, in the 1980s. And if I could just mention the title before we go on, I really like the title. I cannot remember who exactly made up the title, but we had excited discussions in the Lesbian History Group about all of it. So somehow we chose this one because at that time, and I don't know whether it still happens, if girls had passionate relationships with friends at school, girlfriends, in other words, they weren't doing the right thing, they would be told by their doctors, psychiatrists, and so on, and even probably the neighbors and friends, well, it's just a passing phase. Don't worry about it. She will eventually get married, do all the right things, and so on. So from that, we got this wonderful title, which said, no, it is not a passing phase. Lesbianism is not a passing phase. It's no more than heterosexuality is a passing phase. An awful lot of people are heterosexual in their youth, and nobody says that to them. Nobody says that. Okay, so the book was written by members of the Lesbian History Group in London in the late 1980s. Now, the Lesbian History Group, as we called it, was formed by Rosemary Okmuty and I in particular, out of our concerns that the Feminist History Group, of which we were members, did not consider the issue of lesbian history. It concentrated on the history of heterosexuality. And we both published pieces in the book which came out of the Feminist History Group, The Sexual Dynamics of History. That was 1983, and that's a book we haven't done on here either. So we were influential in creating the title of that book, The Sexual Dynamics of History, from the Feminist History Group, because we thought the feminist history should not just be descriptive, showing what women did in history, which we called putting the women back in because they'd been excluded and history only covered men, which was absolutely the case. We also thought it should be more than what we called what they had for breakfast history, i.e. putting women back in, but concentrating on the details of women's lives, fascinating though they were, such as what women had for breakfast before going down to work in the mines. That's interesting, but we thought it should be much more than that. So we made it the sexual dynamics of history. We thought it should look at how men have managed to keep women in subordination, the sexual dynamics. So we set up the Lesbian History Group because Feminist History Group was not really suited to covering lesbians. It didn't cover lesbians. And we moved towards creating a book of our own. And we took the same approach in the Lesbian History Group. The lesbian history we were interested in was not just about putting the lesbians back in or describing their lives, fascinating though that was, but looking at the dynamics by which lesbians were oppressed in history and excluded from the writing of it. How was history and male domination made heterosexual? That is what we wanted to know. It should be remembered that the Lesbian History Group and the book came out of a time when lesbian feminist culture was at its peak in London. Very, very hard to imagine this time now. The Lesbian History Group met fortnightly at Wesley House, which was a London women's centre funded by Camden Council, and it was a fantastic facility. Wesley House also housed the Lesbian Archive, which I was involved in, which was at its peak in the late 80s and ran big events at which US lesbian authors like the novelist Jane Rule spoke. And of course, these big events were completely women only. There was no question about men trying to get in. For instance, there was a launch by Mary Daly or Berry Daly's Pure Lust at Conway Hall in London, it was women only. Nobody talked about having men there. No men were trying to get in. So the culture and community available for lesbians at London at that time is completely unimaginable now, but it was a wonderful time to be alive in that respect. So I'll just hand over to Marian for a moment, who's doing this book with me, and ask her how she came across this book and what she thought about it at the time that she did.
I came across it I just moved down to Washington, D.C. area. I came across it in what was then remaining one of the few gay bookstores still in Washington, D.C. And things happened earlier here for you. That was an exciting time when this book was published, that lesbians were around, that gay rights were around. But things had already started to slide here. This book, this is the American, I don't know if you can see it. This is the American publication of it, different photo on it. And our heyday had pretty much passed in the 70s and 80s. And by the end of the 80s into the 90s was the beginning of the great slide away from a vibrant, lesbian gay community. Gay men continued to have their places where they had sex and things like that, but for lesbians it was it was the beginning of the great slide away. So I came across it, and not a passing phase, very interesting title. While you were talking, it reminded me of the women who detransition or who talk about why they didn't transition, saying, oh yes, I was a tomboy when I was a kid and I played all these sports and I wore jeans and things like that. And then they say, thank God, that they really turned out to be straight and now they have a husband and all this. So for them it was just a passing phase. And it's excuse me, and it's really, they've really kind of got it backwards, because it's heterosexuality is like not a passing phase. If you're straight, you're straight. So it reminded me of that. But that's how I found the book, and I read it, and I'm going to do a couple of these chapters, and I'm reading it and even looking at it, and and the more things change, the more they remain the same. There was, I even looked at, I've looked at, there were pulp lesbian novels. There were even some that were actually halfway decent novels about being lesbian in the 40s, in the 30s, in the 20s, and it with Charlotte Bronte and the woman who she was writing letters with. So I get not a passing phase. I mean, I got it. I was like, oh, okay.
Thanks, Marian. Bebo Brinker novels, as I recall, from the sort of 1950s and 60s. I'm sure you will have read them as well. I have loads of them upstairs. Anyway, we won't do them on here probably. Okay, so I'm gonna go into talking about the introduction to the book now. Now, as I remember, the introduction to the book was mostly written by Rosemary Okamuti, who also has 2 chapters in it, but in collaboration with others in the Lesbian History Group. And first of all, the introduction looks at why was this book written, and why do we need lesbian history? And as we say in the book, every social group needs access to its own history. We need knowledge of our past to give us cultural roots and a heritage. So in other words, to even exist and have a sense of who we are, we need a history. And that lesbians have been deprived of pretty much all of that and all knowledge of our past. And that keeps us invisible, isolated, and powerless. And I suspect now there's very little understanding of lesbian history at all. And so young women coming out and loving other women, they have no past. They have nothing to fit themselves into. So the chapter looks at the attempts that have been made to hide lesbianism on the grounds that if women knew about it, they might try it. For instance, in 1921, there was an attempt to criminalize lesbianism in Parliament, and the discussion in Parliament said, oh, we shouldn't talk about it, we shouldn't have a law against it, because women might know they could do it. They went into detail and said all of those women who just sleep over in beds with each other at country houses on the weekends, they might suddenly realize they could be lesbians. So we absolutely mustn't have a law against it. So that's one good thing. We didn't have a law against it. Joe, could you put up the first slide? Sorry, the second. That's one. That's it. Thank you. So this slide is about why we need lesbian history, and it's from Adrienne Rich, the US lesbian philosopher. She says, the denial of reality and visibility to women's passion for women, women's choice of women as allies, life, companions, and community. The forcing of such relationships into dissimulation and their disintegration under extreme pressure have meant an incalculable loss to the power of all women to liberate ourselves and each other. So I'm going to go on from why we need lesbian history in the introduction to the section on the difficulties of writing lesbian history. And there are many very serious difficulty to be able to do that. Because though we can write women's history because it's quite easy to find women, we know where they are. I mean, we know what women look like, we know who women are. So if you want to find women, it's a little easier to find women in history than it is to find lesbians. Finding the lesbians is very difficult because of all the reasons they've been suppressed, hidden, and so on. And lesbians do not leave records of their lives. If they do autobiographies, they will leave out the lesbianism for good reason. They or their family will burn letters, and Marian's going to talk in her about a chapter in which that features, and they will seek to expunge the family any evidence of lesbianism. Lesbians in history will be normalized, they will be talked about in relation to men and to men in their family, not women's friendships, not women's relationships. Any fleeting relations with men will be made much of, and relations with women will be left out. Often you can find the lesbian by looking at her network, and Rosemary's chapter in the book on women's networks and lesbianism is a wonderful examination of this. She looks at networks of spinsters who set up university settlements, theatres, women's hospitals in the area around Vauxhall, just south of the Thames in London. Some of them were very obviously lesbians, and it's most likely that the women who were their best friends and in their network were also lesbians. So we have to find the lesbians. Also, there's this thing that's said about the First World War. Oh, she had a boyfriend who died in the First World War. I can remember being told that about my Auntie Edie, who was a spinster all her life. Not that I'm suggesting she was a lesbian, because I'm not sure she was. But we were told that her boyfriend died in the war, so she was excused. There's often straight denial, and that is much more difficult to do in terms of women, Black people, working class people. We know they're there, they can't be denied. You can't say they weren't there. Some women today, of course, are now being said to be not really lesbians because they were really men. So there's a transing of history going on that wasn't happening back in the 1980s. It is happening now. So we've got a reinterment of lesbians. They're being buried in queer. Can we have the next slide, John? Now, historians and feminist historians in particular have difficulty using the word lesbian for those they are documenting, because the word lesbian was and is seen as an insult, because lesbianism can be seen as a perversion. So a lot of the historians have anxiety about libeling the dead. And this comes from a belief, this is what it says in the book, that the term lesbian refers solely to sexual practice and not to a mode of life in which a woman's political, intellectual, emotional, social, and sexual energies are focused on other women. So we argue there's a great deal more to being a lesbian historically than simply sexual contact, whether or not they did in fact have sexual contact, and we're going to talk about that as well. Can I have the next slide? Sure. Oh, yes, there we got it. So, how do we prove whether someone's a lesbian or not? Because, of course, we mustn't libel them. We mustn't suggest anybody's a lesbian. I mean, this never happens with heterosexuality. There's no worry about calling people heterosexual in history. It's just assumed that they are, and that is ordinary. So, because of society's reluctance to admit that lesbians exist, there's a high degree of certainty expected before historians or biographers are allowed to use the label. What our critics want is incontrovertible evidence of sexual activity between women, which is almost impossible to find. How many of us, heterosexual or lesbian, keep a written or photographic account of our sexual experiences for posterity? More to the point, would we expect this standard of proof of heterosexuality? Well, of course, that is simply not expected. People are just assumed to be heterosexual. There don't need to be photographs of them engaged in genital activity. We should feel free, though, we argue, to examine all the evidence and make our interpretations of who was a lesbian based on all the relevant issues: lifestyle, friends, work, interests, ideas, politics, as well as sexuality. And of course, historically, even if two women lived together and had their heads on the same pillow all of their lives, they can be seen as not lesbians. Their lesbianism can be denied if the genital contact cannot in some way be proven, and if they didn't write about that in letters, take photographs of it, and so on and so on. So on to a section in the chapter on what is a lesbian. How do we define and therefore identify lesbians in history? So I think we could probably go on to, I'm just a little bit worried about the time here. Let's go on to the next chapter that I'm going to talk about, which is the first chapter in the book.
You can go ahead. You can go ahead. Don't worry about the time, Sheila. My chapters, don't worry about the time. Mine are a little shorter, so don't worry about it.
Okay. So let's go on to the next slide, which is about the first chapter of the book, which I wrote. And it's called, Does It Matter If They Did It? Which is actually not my title. It was first published in a radical feminist journal in 1984 in the UK. And I think the editors of Trouble and Strife made the title, but I think it's a lovely title. And so we're thinking now then about, does it matter if they did it? Can somebody be called a lesbian if they weren't involved in genital activity? Or if we cannot prove that they were involved in genital activity, and so on. So as we say in the book, in the chapter, I'm talking about Lillian Faderman's work in particular in the chapter. Lillian Faderman wrote this wonderful book called Surpassing the Love of Men, which we haven't yet talked about, and we must do on this channel. She showed that passionate friendships with other women were a crucial part of the lives of middle-class women in the 18th and 19th centuries. She, in common with other American feminist historians, found that the diaries and letters of these women would almost inevitably reveal a same-sex friendship, which was likely to have involved passionate embraces and kisses, declarations of love, sharing a bed for a night of cuddles and intimacies, and would often last from childhood to old age. Now, Faderman included all of these friendships in what she saw as the history of lesbianism, and so would I. She, however, received some very fierce criticism from other lesbians. There were two approaches in the criticism. One, that she does disservice to the women she includes, who would not have called themselves lesbians and might be horrified. The other is that she does a disservice to lesbians by desexualizing lesbians. So the question of whether these relationships between women, which were extremely passionate, lasted all their lives, and were probably much more important than their relationships with their husbands, should be included, is a very important one. Women used to go on the honeymoons with a woman who was getting married, who was getting married to someone she hardly knew and probably had not much interest in at all. So she wanted her best friend with her So they would stroll along the promenade together, the three of them, and the husband probably had not much interest in them either. He'd probably be thinking his own thoughts, and the women would be arm in arm, snuggling up together, being as close as they ever would be. But in the future, they'd only be able to sort of go together at weekends and sleep in the same bed and so on. But that was completely normal. The husbands thought it was normal. It was societally seen as normal. So should sex be a proof of genital connection be important to defining who lesbians are? Can we have the next slide, Joe? So the genital sexual practices currently identified by many people as characterizing lesbianism have been taking place for centuries, for example, between prostitutes. But in that context, their function has been, and still is, to titillate and excite men. That is still the case, of course, to all these men in women's dresses who are trying to get into lesbian spaces. They've also been tried out by women whose commitment to the heterosexual system has never been in doubt. By contrast, lesbianism, as understood by lesbian feminists, is a passionate commitment to women, a culture, a political alternative to the basic institution of male supremacy, a means through which women have always gained self-respect and pursued their own goals and achievements with the support of other women. It's more than likely to include a sexual component which may or may not take a genital form. So that was my understanding of how lesbianism should be defined at that time. So the chapter finishes with the interesting case of the Scotch verdict, which is the Scotch verdict is in Lillian Faderman's Surpassing the Love of Men. And it's a book in its own right, because Lillian Faderman wrote a whole book about it after Surpassing the Love of Men. And it concerns the case of two women teachers at a private girls' school they ran in Scotland in the early 19th century. I think this was about 1819, something like that. And the teachers, they slept together. And on one occasion, they took a teenage girl to be with them in their bed, not for sexual purposes. It was very often the case that women would sleep together or with other girls as a sort of comfort. It was very cold in Britain and there wasn't much heating, and being overnight with somebody was a form of comfort very often. So it is likely that the girl needed comfort and they took her to their bed. She then said in the next day or whenever that they had engaged in sexual genital practices. She said she heard them and felt them rubbing each other or doing something with each other. Now that's fascinating in itself, because it suggests that she knew about lesbianism and lesbian sexual practices at a time when, in theory, nobody was supposed to know about this, but she obviously did know about it in order to be able to comment upon it. The case came to court because these women were seen as doing this unacceptable practice. But the women, this was the extraordinary thing about the Scotch verdict, is that the women were found not guilty of any problematic practices because the court could not believe that women did such things. And that's what's extraordinary, really, about the Scotch verdict, and why Lillian Faderman saw it as worthwhile doing a whole book about that. Can we go on to the next slide, Joe? Yes, so what we're going to do now is go on to Marian, who is going to talk about chapter 2.
Okay, chapter 2, through all the changes and through all chances, the relationship of Ellen Nussey and Charlotte Bronte. Let's see. The idea that Charlotte Bronte, and I had trouble with some of the slides, so I'm going to be reading a bit. The idea that Charlotte Bronte, the apparent goddess of heterosexual romance, Jane Eyre, was in love with a woman for most of her life in a way that would today be identified or described as lesbian, might come as a shock. Yet it is not entirely new. Most notably, E.F. Benson, in the biography of Charlotte Bronte, written in 1932, described her relationship with Ellen Nussey as an emotional thread that for years was the vividest color in Charlotte's life. This relationship, I mean, they met at school. So was it a mutual crush? They had feelings for each other. That's nothing new. And when I read this book, I kept thinking, the more things change, the more things remain the same, because you can, and I happened to see on my bookshelves a book written like 100 years after the relationship between Charlotte and Ellen, called Olivia. In fact, it was the book that Olivia Records used as to inspire the name of their company. And it was about a girl who had a crush on her teacher in a school. So this is nothing new. Charlotte, it's unclear whether Charlotte was bisexual. Somebody asked about this, or she was with men for career and public image reasons, although she seemed to prefer women. Ellen was a bit obsessed. She said she received 500 letters from Charlotte, and 300 of them survived in manuscript or print. So that's a lot of letters, and suggests a lot more than just, oh, we're just buds, Charlotte didn't save any letters at all from Ellen, but that is not necessarily her fault. And we'll kind of get into that. The correspondence between the two of them spans the years from 1831 to 1855. That's a long time to be writing letters to someone. That's more than just oh, we kind of like each other. They went back and forth, and and they declared their love for each other, that they wanted to live with each other. They spent time together on trips. They stayed various places in the country together. This is Charlotte Bronte was able to do this because she was making some money from her writings, had support, financial, at least from her family, and she the book goes on to say, since the destiny of all women was presumed to be marriage at the time, it's hardly surprising that in 1839, Ellen's brother Henry proposed marriage to Charlotte. So here they are, having this, relationship that everybody's seeing, and Ellen's brother is just like, oh, well, I'll just marry Charlotte. She refused him, though in a letter to Ellen, she confessed that she was greatly tempted to marry Henry so that she could live with Ellen. The price, however, appeared to have been far too high. Charlotte had several other women who, as romantic interests, who were interested in her, wanted to live with her. There was, if you were in lesbian bars years ago, when there were lesbian bars, when everybody knew everybody, and you walked in and it's like, oh, she was her lover and I was my lover, and she was her lover. That it kind of reminded me of that. Ellen had only one other woman that she was romantically interested in, and Charlotte was jealous. Charlotte ultimately did marry a man. Was she attracted to him? Was it out of a sense of duty? She said that her husband told her to burn all the letters from Ellen. So all those letters, I mean, back and forth, Ellen said that there were 500. All those letters that Charlotte wrote are gone because her family did not want her to be seen as having had a woman as a lover, as having had a relationship with another woman. One other thing that's interesting to read is that in addition, as Elizabeth Gaskell pointed out, biographer, there was some little jealousy of Miss Nussey on Mr. Bronte's part. It's unclear whether that's her father or her brother, or her husband, who she's I think mistakenly referred to as Mr. Bronte at one point. According to the biographer, he felt that he forbade Ellen to see the finished manuscript, the biography of Charlotte's life, in order that that the biographer, to her credit, disobeyed. So we can fast forward 100 years, and the relationship dynamics between women who want to be with each other hasn't changed. I mean, in some ways, it hasn't changed at all. The circumstances allowing women to express and act on that feeling for each other changed for a while, but now, now it is, you know, there's again, if you look at Olivia Records, one of the first albums they put out had a song on it, and this was in 1973 or 4, where a woman is singing a love song to another woman. That was absolutely unheard of. That was absolutely unheard of. So all the things, the fundamentals of you know, woman meets woman, woman falls in love with woman, woman tries to, in her circumstances, have a relationship with another woman. That has only changed by what the circumstances were like. How difficult was it to do? Women could not, you know, work independently for a long time. So that didn't change. But how lesbians had to hide it, whether they had to hide it, the things they had to do to hide it, whether or not they wanted to hide it, not, you know, that's just circumstantial stuff that has changed. But this is a relationship that happened a really long time ago, that you read it and you're just like, yeah, it seems like, well, of course they're in love, of course they're, and that was something that was pretty thoroughly suppressed in those days. So my take on this book, I mean, when I first read it, and you know, years later now, is that Lesbian was there. If it, you know, if it's there, if you've got this attraction to women, you've got this attraction to women, and you are either lucky enough to be born in a time and place where you can act on it, where you can know that there are other women who feel the same way, which is a really, really profound thing for lesbians. So I, you know, I I feel a little sorry for them, but I'm glad they had the relationship that they had. So we'll move back to we can move back to Sheila.
Let's have the next slide, Joe. I think what we're going to do is go on with you, Marian. But can I just say something before we do that? While you were talking, I was just thinking about the women's relationships in the 19th century and indeed the early 20th century. The situation was that they had no means of support. There were not jobs for women. And one of the things that Lillian Faderman talks about, and I talk about in my work, is that at the end of the 19th century, suddenly there were jobs. Women could become typewriters, as they were called, meaning typists. They could be teachers. And it was possible for women to move out and, you know, rent places to live, and in that way become lesbians. That was simply not possible before. And even up to the 1930s, women very regularly were marrying men, often, as in the case of certain very famous women novelists and so on, and they would marry a gay man, and they would be known that they were both a lesbian and a gay man, but they needed to carry on the family name, have the children, have some way of earning a living. So things changed hugely when it was possible for women actually to move out of their family homes, to earn money, and it was the freedom to have relationships. Anyway, that's all I wanted to say. Let's just go on to your interpretation of chapter 5.
And that kind of fits in nicely, because chapter 5, the title is Embittered Sexless or Homosexuals, or Homosexual Attacks on Spinster Teachers from 1918 to 1939. So the interwar years. During the interwar years in Britain, the perceived image of the spinster teacher suffered an increasingly negative change, resulting in the stereotype of an embittered, thwarted, sexually frustrated, or deviant woman. So women became lesbian, whether they wanted to be or not, as a means of social control. mostly these women were, these spinsters were elementary or primary school teachers. Later, they also taught on the secondary school level. So this was one of the jobs that a woman on her own could have to make money to support herself. This wasn't the case when Charlotte Bronte was alive, and the fact that she could, try to make a living out of her pen, out of her writing, was very unusual. But now there were these spinster teachers who were kind of thought of as lesbians, no matter what they did. The school teaching was the only profession in which large numbers of women could earn a salary which was much above subsistence level, although they still received only 4/5 of men's pay. School teaching was a public role. Women teachers were visible and indeed important figures in their local communities. They also, of course, had authority and influence over the children in their schools. And this large number of single women teachers at this time could also be explained by demographic factors. There had been more women than men in the population since the mid-19th century, in any event, when it was first seen as a problem, and the high rates of mortality of men during the First World War exacerbated that pattern. So nonetheless, the predominance of spinster teachers could be explained by a lot of these circumstances beyond their control: loss of men in the war, and the marriage bar. So why then should women teachers be abused as spinsters? The marriage bar was twofold. As one is, they initially were not allowed to get married at all. They had to remain single. And it was just hard for them to find, even if they wanted to marry, to find men to marry anyway, because a lot of men had died in the war. So they were kind of outside of heterosexuality, while stressing sexual love between women as the primary significance of lesbianism. A feminist approach has also emphasized the position of lesbians as women outside heterosexuality, who by their very existence challenge the myth of its inevitability. It's like, here are women doing what everyone said. It's like, women can't do that. They're not allowed to, and they just aren't fit for it. So if heterosexuality is one of the ways in which men's power over women is maintained, then lesbianism is or can be a threat to that power. This aspect of resistance involves all women outside heterosexuality, including celibate or unmarried women. Thus, although attacks were made on unmarried women teachers, primarily as spinsters rather than as lesbians, it is probable that they were maligned for being outside heterosexuality itself. And it is pretty extraordinary that 100 years later, again, 4B is doing what these women did as spinster teachers. There was antagonism between male and female teachers in teachers' unions. Some women split off. They formed a different union for women teachers. The sexologists were around then who said that women really all had this maternal instinct, which is part of their sexuality, and was good because that they could that way be a teacher for young children and for women. And there was a question of whether boys should only be taught by male teachers, and that's an interesting question because girls do better in completely female schools from like kindergarten through finishing college, finishing university, on every measurable parameter. Girls do infinitely better. Boys do somewhat better in all boys schools, but it's not the difference is not as profound, and is largely felt that I've read some educators writing about that is that boys just plain don't listen to women teachers. You can't tell them what to do. You can't tell them what to learn. You can't tell them what they know and they don't know. And they do a little bit better because they at least listen to the male teachers, and any behavioral disruptions can be pretty much slammed. So there's so that is a question. That's another question, but for girls, being taught by women teachers, infinitely better under all circumstances. And there was the the fact that women were independent, the sexual threat that spinster teachers were seen to pose can't be disentangled from the economic threat that they presented to men. They were attacked as sexually independent spinsters and as feminists, but also economically powerful women who challenged men's authority by demanding equal opportunities in the profession. The stigmatization of spinster teachers wasn't solely a result of sexology, but also part of a post-war climate which was hostile to women's economic and political power. So the women teachers gradually did win higher pay, but still never equal to men. Men earned what was called a family wage because, you know, they had to support families. I always smile when I read that. My father, who was a World War II veteran, you know, greatest generation guy, turned out to be like pretty amazing when he was working as an engineer and found out that the women engineers didn't make the same amount of money for doing the same job. So here's my father's, you know, really new in the company, walking into the president's office and telling the president of the company that you have to pay women the same amount because they're doing the same work, and getting the argument that but they have to support families, and that at least to an intelligent man, this was wrong. So it's something I mentioned because it's so unusual and extraordinary, and I was very surprised. There was also some women were eventually also allowed to be married, but they couldn't have kids and continue to teach. There was some, you know, rancor about women being in positions of authority, especially over men. But our foremothers fought back. But only up to a point, which I understand in the context of the time it was, but you know, just before the First World War, a different attitude was developing among some other feminists, which was to become more influential as the time between the wars went on towards World War II. They were influenced by sexology, especially the writings of Havelock Ellis, No Friend to Women. They supported free unions, divorce law reform, and the use of birth control as separate from, you know, to separate sex from reproduction. They ultimately felt that there should be a reform movement which stressed the necessity of heterosexual intercourse for women and the dangers of sexual repression. They also attacked lesbians and spinsters who remained outside heterosexuality. Oh, a mention of you know, women's you know, we need to mention that the first terminology, spinsterhood, was ultimately seen to really be the same thing as lesbianism. That you couldn't be a spinster unless you were a lesbian, because all women really wanted to be heterosexual. Men continued to consider marriage and motherhood a biological duty for women. Spinsterhood again was portrayed as negative, that women were thwarted because they really wanted to be in men and these spinsters couldn't. So you know, so they it was said that they sterilized themselves because they never, you know, had intercourse, and you know, that married women made better teachers because they were maternal, because they had full lives, because they were doing their duty to the race, and they and I wonder today if the women of 4B are aware of all this, and I suspect that they are, because they're doing what those women did for the same reasons, I think. And again, it's the more things change, the more they remain the same. Back to you, Sheila.
Thanks very much, Marian. And somebody has a couple of women are talking in the chat about how most of the discussion we're having is about middle-class women, because of course it's middle-class women in particular who got these jobs as teachers after the 1870 Education Act in the UK and so on. We did talk about the problem of getting knowledge of relationships between working class women in the lesbian history group at the time that we were doing the book. The problem was that working class women, they were likely to be in service. You know, there were hundreds of thousands of women in service at the time, in domestic service, in people's houses. But it was very difficult to get information about their lives because they were unlikely, particularly before the 1870 Education Act, to be literate. They weren't likely to be having the time and the opportunities to be writing anything down. So getting information about them was very difficult. But we do know that they lived in the servants' quarters, very often shared beds. Women were likely to be sharing rooms. And it's extremely likely that they had passionate friendships and relationships with each other. And possibly if they remained spinsters for the whole of the time that they were in service and living together. But we don't know the information about that. So what I'm going to go on to now is the other chapter that I wrote in the book. And could we please have the next slide, Joe? So my next chapter in the book is called Butch and Femme Now and Then. And I wrote it in the 1980s because I was tremendously concerned that butch and femme, that lesbian role-playing, which was a part of lesbian life in the 1950s, 1960s, before lesbian feminism, before feminism had an influence, was coming back and being promoted as authentic, real lesbianism and what real lesbians should be doing, what lesbianism should be about. So as I explain here, the piece was first published in Gossip, which was a lesbian journal in the UK. So as I write here, in the late 1960s and early 1970s, a feminist critique was developing of butch and femme role-playing in lesbian relationships. It was a shock to many lesbians in the 1980s to find that some lesbians in the US, and it was a US thing, who could be seen as the leaders of their communities, such as Joan Nessel from the Lesbian Archive, for instance, who were involved in recording our history, sorry about the typos here, as novelists, writers on sexuality, were identifying themselves again as butch and femme. And that was a shock. It was a great shock at the time because we were promoting the eroticizing of equality in love and sexual relationships between women. And to suddenly see the promotion of what was clearly hierarchical and about power and power difference was a huge shock to us. It was the very opposite of all the values and philosophy we were creating both in the UK and in the US, as our lesbian feminist community and values. Now, these role players that were re-promoting butch and femme were called heroines in a reinvented lesbian history, and they were called authentic lesbians. Can we go on to the next slide, Joe? Now, Julia Penelope is a very important lesbian philosopher from the US, who was writing about all of these issues at the time in the 1980s. And she was also horrified by the revival of butch and femme because she was involved in and suffered from a role-playing culture before she found feminism and lesbian feminism. And she was, in fact, a stone butch at that time. Being stone meant not allowing a female partner to touch you. It was seen as the gold star lesbian role in the 50s and the 1960s. And being stone proved a lesbian was the most butch and the most masculine. The fascinating thing is, and I have written about this, it was similar in male gay culture in the 60s, 70s, even 1980s, that when gay men were going out looking for sexual partners in the street, cruising and so on, the person who made a move to touch the other person lost. You had to be stone, and that was about masculinity. So it's fascinating that it went across both lesbian and gay culture at that time. Anyway, this is Julia Penelope. She says, the impulse to revive the labels butch and femme and inject some political respectability into their meaning, however belatedly, by talking about gut feelings, intuitions, and power, is the lesbian manifestation of the contemporary right-wing backlash, further encouraged by 50s nostalgia. She was furious. It's lovely to see the anger sort of pour through her words here, because she had suffered it all. So the lesbians who promoted role-playing afresh in the 1980s said that role-playing was nothing to do with heterosexuality and nothing to do with hierarchy. And in the chapter, I give lots of examples of how 1950s role-playing was actually very, very certainly about hierarchy. Can we have the next slide, Jo? Merrill Mushroom was also writing much about this at the time. Now, Merrill Mushroom was a playwright and writer. She wasn't involved in the old role-playing of the 50s and 60s, but she writes about it, and she is pro role-playing. And she says a great deal of public ridicule and embarrassment came down on a butch who went femme, mainly because of the demeaning social attitudes towards femaleness. The derision shown towards those few butches who had been flipped, it was called being flipped. In other words, allowing another woman to touch you and make you female, was enough to prevent many of us, especially those of us who were not yet secure about our sexuality, from letting our partners touch us during lovemaking. So that's very clearly about power, and she's writing later. She's not 50s and 60s, she's sort of 70s into 80s. And there were many other examples of this as well. Can we have the next slide, 13, of the power relationship? So the sexologists constructed a model of lesbianism which the women doing butch and femme were certainly following. The sexologists at the end of the 19th and early 20th century created the model of what they saw as the lesbian pervert. It was a very hostile model, and I explain it here. Since the propagation of sexological ideas of the real lesbian in the late 19th and early 20th century, i.e. mannish, able to whistle, and so on, everybody watching might like to try and whistle now. I have to tell you, I'm not very good at it, but to be a proper real lesbian, you have to be able to do it. It's butch lesbians who have adopted the identity of real lesbians. That is true now too, right now in 2025. The realness of femmes has always been in doubt. Havelock Ellis distinguished between the actively inverted woman and the woman to whom the actively inverted woman is most attracted. The former had one fairly essential character, a more or less distinct trace of masculinity. The latter were always womanly. So this is the model of a lesbianism that was created. And in fact, Havelock Ellis explained that the real one would sort of have these powerful magical eyes that would stare at, I always think of it as being like a mongoose and a snake, and hypnotize the properly heterosexual woman who would fall under her sway. And it was this idea of lesbianism as frightening, falling under the sway of the real butch. However, the real lesbian. However, this was the model that was picked up and being promoted pretty much in the 1950s. And I have to say, to a large extent, the model is coming back, but I don't think we'll have much time to talk about that today. Can we have the next slide? So, was it biology? Was it hierarchy? The fascinating work from Ethel Sawyer about the Black lesbian community in the 1960s. And one indication of the hierarchy is that studs were called, the butch lesbians were called studs, and the so-called feminine lesbians were called fish. So it's very obvious from simply the titles. I don't know why anybody doesn't take notice of simply what the names, the words are. Anyway, Ethel Sawyer said, most studs were first fish, and fish are the first to divulge this information. So in other words, they came out because somebody touched them and made them a lesbian, as it were. But then, of course, they wanted to be studs because that was the higher power validated position, and they didn't want to be fish anymore. So that rather gives the lie to the idea that this sort of butch lesbianism is somehow biological. This real lesbianism is somehow biological. Merrill Mushroom talks to us about how or why lesbians did role-playing at that time. It was safer to go out on a date with a femme to a straight place if we could pass. Men sometimes beat up lesbians on the street. So looking like a heterosexual couple was crucial and remained so for a long time, and still presumably in many places is even today. Maleness, Merrill says, was equated with power, strength, pride, and freedom. Femaleness was equated with weakness, dependency, and obedience. Female images were used in ways that were shameful and degrading. So, you know, if you were given the choice, which would you go for, being degraded or having power, strength, pride, and freedom? So you can see what was attractive about these different roles. Now, fascinatingly, Ethel Sawyer tells us that the researchers who were talking to the studs and fish found that they couldn't find fish to interview. The disadvantage of the fish's marginality was that the researcher found it difficult to find fish to interview. The studs were astonished that she should wish to speak with fish. In other words, the fish weren't even seen as lesbians. Why would anybody really want to talk to the inferior? And of course, at the time, as much of the information about butch and pell role-playing will tell us, the fish or the femmes were supposed to sit round tables in the bar, and only the studs went to get drinks. Only the studs did any things that were seen as the masculine right, and the fish or femmes were excluded. Now, could we have the next slide, Joe? Now, this is the feminist rejection of role-playing. Early 1970s, American lesbian feminists just really hit back at role-playing. This is Del Martin and Phyllis Lyon, both of whom were involved in the lesbian culture that included role-playing in the 1950s and 60s. And they completely rejected it, said it was an imitation of heterosexuality and lesbians didn't have to do that. And this is just a little quote from them. They say, strangely, it is women who feel they are born butch who tend to ape all the least desirable characteristics of men. In this case, one may well say to these butches, up against the wall, male chauvinist pig, which I love, really. That's sort of doing a sort of what feminists were saying about men at the time and saying, you know, this is just not acceptable, the imitation of male behavior. Can we have the next slide, please, Joe? The last slide. Now, what happened, I argue, and I've written about this quite a bit, that what was the reinvention of role-playing in the 1980s was sadomasochism. It was about power. There was a cult of sadomasochism amongst some lesbians at the time because they saw sex without power difference, and often very cruel and unpleasant power difference, was not exciting. And this is Meryl Mushroom, and I think she makes it clear that there is a sort of mild sadomasochism involved in the role-playing that she is promoting. There were loads of anthologies promoting butch and femme at the time, really lots coming out of the United States from Joan Nessel and others saying how exciting it was. So this is Meryl Mushroom. The basic dynamics of butch-femme relating involve power, trust, vulnerability, tenderness, and caring. And actually, those are words that are used by the promoters of sadomasochism. I know it's extraordinary, but they were used to promote sadomasochism. When I, as a butch, demand of my lover, give it to me, baby, now, being as deep inside her as I can penetrate, and she completely releases herself and flows out to me. Sometimes I want want her, it should be, I think, to take me right away. And then I seduce her the way a femme seduces a butch. Seduce her into taking me instead of wanting me to take her. Sometimes her own butch streak will dominate and she will have her way with me and I will let her. So you can see how this is completely the opposite of all the work we were doing as feminists and lesbian feminists at that time to create a sexuality of equality, because we knew that while sexuality was based on dominance and difference of power, male violence against women and sexual violence would continue. We wanted to create a totally different future for women, lesbian and all women, in which the terrible violence involved in the construction of sexuality was eliminated. Butch and femme, unfortunately, brought it back. So it was a way of bringing the power back in and creating a sexuality of inequality. I argue in the 1980s. Now, of course, we have a situation where many lesbians call themselves butch. They think this is a good thing to do and that butch simply means lesbian. Butch doesn't simply mean lesbian. It didn't in Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. And it doesn't now. Butch means masculine, and it's very, very unfortunate that butch has become a way of referring to lesbians. And all the biological stuff from sexologists come back. There are many lesbians who believe that they're biologically lesbian, some who believe they're biologically butch, despite all the evidence to the contrary, even in their own lives. So that's it for now. We're not in a position to really explore that right now. But thank you for listening to all of this. And I hope you'll go on being fascinated by lesbian history. And thanks so much to Marian for discussing this book with me.
Happy to be here. Thanks very much, Sheila.